We're going to be in James 4:6. I guess we could go ahead and start, and when people show up, they show up. And if people don't, then they don't. Well, that's fine. But if y'all would, go ahead and turn to James 4:6. And I'd like to do a little lesson about humility, to be honest with you. I don't know why I got into reading something else when I was doing some studying, and I started working on it, and something else started making me a little more curious, and then I ended up changing over to this, and it was we'll go ahead and pray.
That's all right.
Dear Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the ability to come to your house again, Lord. I just thank you for this ministry, Lord. Ability to be in your word, to study it, to study and share. To be honest, to be able to talk about your word here in Sunday school, Lord. I thank you for that.
Yes.
Father, I know we've got many people still traveling. Just ask for your mercy for their travels, Lord. Father, I thank you for Brother Nat mentioned when we first came in. I appreciate his kindness towards me and my family. Lord, we know what's going on with our country, and we just ask that you be with our president, be with our country, and guide the decisions, Lord. Make them your decisions. Make them, Lord, if they abide in you, Lord, and we know that we'll be okay. And I just ask that you guide those things. And Father, I thank you that Brother Jeff's son proposed, Lord, his son Jeff, and what Jared mentioned, Lord, Brother Jared mentioned, they're traveling back to Nebraska, Lord. Such a blessing to see people united and soon to be matrimony, Lord. That the whole picture of, to be honest, of what your son is to us. And Father, I thank you that you gave us your son. I thank you that we have a Savior, a Redeemer, Lord, and we're able to commune with you through him, through his shed blood. And Father, I thank you that we're here today. Lord, I just ask that I ask that you bless this Sunday school lesson. I ask that you be with our pastor and guide them during service today.
Yes, Lord.
Lord, I ask that you be with those who are not here today. In your Son's name I pray, Christ Jesus. Amen. And so and to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't even remember where I was studying, but afterwards, I started getting into another verse, and it was this verse here, and I was like, humility is rather interesting, and so I did a quick word search using eSword to see how many times humility is mentioned in the Bible, and it's hundreds.
Yeah,
That's too much, to be honest with you. But then I took every time that humility is mentioned, and I put it over on a piece of paper. And then I noticed that the Strong's numbers for each one of those times, they weren't all the same. And so I was like, okay, so there's different words that translate over to humility. And then started figuring out how many times per each word, and it was hundreds, to be honest with you. But here in James 4:6, we can read about being humble. And the Strong's word in here only shows up 8 other times in the Bible. So I was like, well, this seems like it'd be a nice, short, little, easy Bible study about being humble. But James 4:6 tells us, "But he giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but give grace unto the humble." And before we press on, We already prayed, but is there anything, any praises you have?
Well, I heard you covered the visit and everything, because I was right outside the door when you prayed.
Oh, okay.
But that was, yeah, that was a big thing. Just praise the Lord. We did a whole lot of travel all over the place, and just glad it looks like we're gonna stop for a while now.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. And we're about to try and pick up some travel family-wise here soon before this fourth baby comes. Get out and do a couple things, and I think with a little extra cash that'll be in my pocket come next paycheck, maybe we'll be able to do it for once. Tell you, kids are a blessing, but they definitely complicates getting out and about.
True. Very true.
And I mentioned this, I don't know if you heard it, I've repaired the Mackie. I got it in the trunk of my car, it's fully operational, all the lines are tested out, I balanced everything in it.
Amazing.
After service today, I'll bring it in. It's been cleaned up too, so.
Oh, man, fantastic.
Yeah.
Praise the Lord. Thank you.
All right, so back to James 4:6. I want to ask you all a question. How would you define humility? What is being humble? What does humility mean to you?
Well, I don't know if this is a synonym word for it, but just one thing coming to my mind is to be submissive. Yeah, to be submissive. And I have to think about that because in order to be that would be, when using my own words and that kind of stuff, that would be a voluntary thing. That wouldn't be anything like a command or anything like that. That would have to be voluntary in a way.
Yeah. Don't disagree with that. Well, actually, if we get to it, we'll see a little bit of that today. Anything else? Anybody else got any thoughts? How you would define humility?
It's kind of, it's a tough one to actually define, but because it covers a lot of different places. But I think
It does.
for me, it's kind of the mirror image of pride. It's the opposite, not the mirror image, but the opposite of anything that you think of as pride. It's kind of when it's like swallowing it. It's like you look at somebody says something to you, and right away, like maybe you get your back up, and you like want to attack back, and it's when you suck it back. And you say, no, I'm not going to do that.
Opposite.
Yeah, huge subject.
It is. That's why, like I said, all the hundreds of times it's translated over, and every time it shows up, there's a greater study to this word, to be honest. You can spend days on it. I do not want to spend days on it. I do that in my own time. But, I think you could even say it would be the mirror image, because if you raise your right hand up in a mirror, it's the other guy's left hand, right? So it's the opposite.
The opposite.
Yeah, now you can say the other side to the coin. If pride was on one side, humility is on the other as well, I guess. Yeah, I like that. I think this verse alone speaks a lot about things concerning being humble. In the first part of this verse, we can read in James, he says, "But he giveth more grace." When it comes to, as we'll see later on, grace given unto being humble. And I believe James 4:1-5 give insight to what God means by humility here. Would one of y'all like to read James 4 verses 1-5?
Okay. James 4:1-5.
Yes, sir.
From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence, even of your lust, that war in your members. Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lust. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Do you think that the scriptures said in vain, the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy?
Think,
Okay.
you go ahead, were you about to say something?
I was just thinking within myself, and those scriptures there,
I think context is key to James 4:6. Hermeneutics is very important, reading the verses before and after. James just spoke here of envy and crimes which grew out of it. However, all were not under these influences at these times. There were those who practiced restraint and were the people with the right spirit opposing these things, prevailing against this envy, etc. You know, our Lord gives more grace to us, or greater grace than the world can give. Proverbs 3:34, if you'll turn over there, speaks a little bit about how he gives grace as well. And Proverbs 3:34 tells us, surely he scorneth the scorners, but he giveth grace unto the lowly. What's interesting to me is that this word here, humble, and if you got an app that gives the Strong's word for it, it's out of the Greek. The number value is G, or alphanumerical is G5011. And the Greek word for this being humble, for having this type of humility, how's it? I'm going to mess up saying it. Tapenos, I think, tapenos is what it is called in the Greek. And the definition thereof, within the Strong's dictionary, is of uncertain derivation, but it could mean depressed, that is figuratively, humiliated in circumstance or disposition. It also means to be base, cast down, humble, of low degree, as in estate, or lowly. And then looking up this word in Noah Webster's 1828, to be humble means to be lowly, modest, meek, submissive, opposed to proud, haughty, arrogant, or assuming. In an evangelical sense, having a low opinion of oneself and a deep sense of unworthiness in the sight of God. And so I feel that it's important that this is something we practice, voluntarily practice, to be humble. And just as context before the verses are key, context within the verse is key. You know, he says in James 4:6, wherefore he saith, you know, why has he made this statement? He's quantified just who will receive the greater grace, right? Wherefore is God's causality, in my opinion, you know, if this, then that, those types of things. I think wherefore is one of those words that you thoroughly enjoy too. And then he says, God, and further in James 4:6, God resisteth the proud. You know, if God gives grace to the humble, are the proud a disgrace? It's a question I ask myself when I read through this this verse here and was studying on it. I mean, what would be a disgrace to God? personally, will somebody look up Isaiah 14, 12 through 14? I think that is a perfect example of being disgraced. But I think what is disgraceful, the self-righteous, the lustful, people we saw as mentioned here in verses 1 through 5, enviers, lovers of the world and material things in it, the prideful, I think those would be very disgraceful. And even resisteth in here is a very unique word in my opinion. To resist is to range oneself against, that is oppose. God has arranged himself against the proud. Did anybody look up Isaiah 14, 12 through 14?
Sorry.
14 and then 12 through 14.
How art thou all nothing, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation, in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will be like the Most High.
There we're talking about the devil himself,
Yeah.
the ultimate disgrace. Who is our father? Is our father of this world, the prince, the power of the air, the devil, or is our father in heaven sitting at the right hand of God? I mean, the devil himself, you can see he's just full of pride. He wanted to be all in, be everything, be greater than everything. I think there's a bit of envy in that. He envied God for creating us, did he? Did he not? But then we read, but God giveth grace unto the humble. And as I said, that comes from the Greek. And the question I ask myself are, who are the humble as it's pertaining to this verse? And so what I would like to do is try and define that word based off of the 8 times that this word tapnos can be found in the Bible. And to be honest with you, it doesn't always translate over to humble. Sometimes it translates to other things like lowly. So we do have other examples of this word from the Greek in our Bible. Brother Nat, will you look up Matthew 11:29? Pastor Jeff, 2 Corinthians 10:1. Jarrett, would you look up 1 Peter 5:5? All right. So these first 2 verses here, when I ask myself, who are the humble as pertain to this verse, I started asking myself other questions too. Well, do we have examples of people who are humble? What does Matthew 11:29 say?
Matthew 11:29 says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls."
Well, we have Christ speaking for us here. That word lowly, that's that same Greek word, tapnos, right here in that verse. And then 2 Corinthians 10:1.
Now I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you.
And Paul here, that word am, or when he says, who in presence am base, that's that word tapnos as well. So I think we've got 2 great examples just by these 2 individuals. You know, Christ is the definitive example of humility, And Paul, who beseeched others in defense of his ministry, based off of who Christ is and considering himself to be base comparatively to the people he was currently among. He was saying that he was the lowest, the low. But yet he's there giving a defense, not based off of him, but based off of Christ. I think those are perfect examples, in my opinion. And then, go ahead.
I was gonna say, that's where I got my, submissiveness and voluntarily from it. Was, this is Matthew 11:29, with Jesus saying, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Now, in that, with him making that statement in that, but it's not a command. He's not commanding that.
That's right.
And so therefore, but he's, letting us to know to do that. This is what will happen if you do that. Letting us know that, but it's something, it's voluntary for us to do it and to submit to doing that. But he's not making it a command to do.
And no, you're absolutely right. And that's what brought me to my second question was, should humility require acts of submissiveness, to be honest? Christ stated for us to take his yoke. He didn't force this, but made it a statement. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. That's a statement. And we were all given that option. We're all given that option. All of us can wake up in the morning and look outside and see his glory. There are no, in my opinion, atheists. There's no such thing. Everything was created by something. You can't say that nothing came out of nowhere. Even people want to believe in evolution or the Big Bang Theory. The laws of mass alone require something to come from something. Energy has to be taken from somewhere else, and in order for an explosion to happen, there has to be something that created everything from the beginning. And then when I asked that question to myself about being submissive, I think it pertains to, I wanted to make sure that I pertain it to certain things as well, like Christian living, for example. And to be honest with you, in 1 Peter 5:5, actually, Brother Jared, if you'll read verses 1 through 5 for us.
The elders which are among you I exhort, to them also another, and witness of the sufferings, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Keep the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, he shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble.
Amen. The word humble there is that same word, tapnos. Here we got it depicted in our Bible as humble again. And the reason why I asked to read that verses 1 through 5, I'll get into that. But notice an act of submitting within these verses here. Notice it's also a two-way street. Speaking of 5:5, being subject one to another. And I wrote myself a little interesting note. The majority of us were in the military or were used to a hierarchy structure. Even in older times here in the UK, kings and queens, right? There was hierarchy. And you could ask of a favor of somebody in the higher structure, but usually you do what's commanded of you. This is telling us that we are to, the younger are to submit to the elder, but then we continue on. We say, yea, all of you be subject one to another as equal parts. So that's why I wrote a little note to myself, man, it's a little bit different than what I'm used to in the military, right? You know, I'm a master sergeant. I've got far less people that govern me now, and I have a lot more people underneath me. And when I put something out for them to do, I expect it to get to be done, right? But at the same point in time, I think what makes a good leader is somebody who's able to work with their people and not just command their people to do. I think there is a two-way street, a open communication. I think there is, well, as the Bible says here, being subject to one another. I mean, if I don't pull my fair share of work, how can I expect others to work for me, right? If I am not honest with my folk, how can I expect them to be honest with me? If I live a life of sin and then tell somebody else not to sin, you see, I could keep going on and on and on. Also notice in the preceding verses, as Brother Jared mentioned, you know, it's also not accomplished by force. It's said right there in verses 1 through 4. Or by pressure. That's that constraint word. Not for gain in money or goods. That's the filthy lucre. And not accomplished through subjugation. That's lords over. I don't think the Lord ever wanted us to be subjugated. You can do a study out that out 1 Samuel chapter 8. That's when the Israelites wanted somebody to lord over them when they were asking for a king. And God did not want that to happen, but He gave them grace in any ways and had them elect their first king. But you saw what comes after that, even with the Old Testament, right? I mean, there were good kings and bad kings. They weren't perfect by any means. You know, a lot of that subjugation was not good for the Israelites. Some of it caused them to sin. Some of it was because they were sinning. So God elected the people at the right time to try to bring them back into the fold. But the main purpose of it is we are to be subject to Him and only Him. We shouldn't want to elect to be subject by anything else. I mean, that's what God's intention is. You know, He is a jealous God. He wants all of us all the time. And I think it's important to remember that. You know, shepherds feed the flock. Elders hold a responsibility within the church. I think all of us have chief responsibility in practicing these things, being subject to one another. God's people then would be, if we could not entrust in ourselves to do something right and then expect it of other people, what can we expect of God's people as we try to lead them in church or anything of that nature? Just where my thoughts go. And to be honest with you, there are many times when I'd rather just keep my mouth shut because I know that I have certain conditions in my life that I have to pray for often. And it would probably behoove me to remind myself that I need to be subject to God, give myself over to Him daily before I even try to share, like even Sunday school, to be honest. Any thoughts before we continue? I know we're getting low on time. Well, got one more question, and then we'll go to prayer. I'm not actually. Yeah, one more question, and then we'll stop there. I won't get into it. We'll go to prayer. Concerning how many times Tappanos showed up in the Bible, One of the verses that I found it showing up in was Romans 12:16. Be of the same mind one toward another, mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Again, it's Romans 12:16. That low estate there, that's the word tapenos. And by that verse, I asked myself, are there implications of unity as it pertains to humility? That's my next question for y'all. I think we'll leave it right there.
Okay.
And if the Lord willing, maybe one day we'll pick back up on this.
You have the same mind one for another, mind not the high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. And naturally, the first thing you think of, we'll leave it as you said, but naturally, the first thing to jump in your mind is the parable that Jesus used of men taking the high seat when they go in a place to sit down and then. All right. We'll leave it what you say.
No. If you got things you want to add, then by all means add. I just didn't want to get into another subject and push us close to 12 o'clock. But you're right, and I do like that. I think that word there, condescend, is a rather interesting word. I think in modern times we take a negative connotation to it, right? To be condescending. But it's to take off that is to transport. It's to passively yield. Is the Strong's definition of it, and to be able to passively yield, I think, is very important when it comes to unity. When it comes to humility, to be honest, which is a greater lesson. I like it. I sat for 4 years as an instructor behind a podium, and I thought it was great because here I am on my ivory tower, right? And all these students, they got to listen to me, but that's not how you really foster things. So, if there wasn't communication within the class, there was most time no learning. Because if I got up there and just went on a diatribe for 10 hours, which was the work day, they tune you out after the first hour anyways. But I need, and to be honest, even yielding in our personal lives, right? Who do we yield to? I mean, should I yield to what Christ has done for me? Should I yield to God's direction? Would that create better unity within church, within people we are with? It's obviously a characteristic of humility, in my opinion. No, that's great. No, I appreciate that. Do you mind closing us in prayer, brother, now?
So, Brother Sean, I need you to bring us our Sunday school lesson. Lord, let us take what we said this morning as far as humility and use it in our lives and everything that we do. Let us be concerned, Lord, and be subject to not only you as our high power, but let us be subject to each other, Lord, and try to reach an understanding before we even speak in the things that we go to do.
Yes.
Lord, we pray now and ask you to be with Pastor this morning.
Yes.
He brings us the message today, Lord, and to give us the word that you would have us do. And Father, we just pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.